Trigger warning. This story includes references to childhood sexual abuse, ritualized control, and coercive religious practices. If you are triggered by these topics, please take care of yourself first. You are not alone, and there are resources linked below. I was married when I was 3. They put a ring on my finger and told me I belonged to him. I didn't know what marriage meant. I only knew the weight of a small metal circle against skin, and the way adults' faces shifted when they looked at me, like I was something fragile and holy at the same time. That image, tiny hand, ring, adults who knew more about me than I did, became the shape of my childhood. This is the story of how I learned to speak again, after a life designed to keep me quiet. My name is Serena. Some people who knew me then called me Mary Dear. I was born into the children of God. My life was photographed and written about in the movement's publications, pages titled Life with Grandpa, that turned our existence into a kind of staged testimony. David Berg was the voice that decided what was holy. He wrote the rules. He decided who was special and who was expendable. His words became a system that justified things no child should have to know. Being raised inside that world felt normal because I had no other point of reference. Meals were rationed by status. Children had assigned roles. Everything was recorded. We were taught that documentation proved devotion, so the cameras were always present, an audience for our lives. I remember the blue light of a basement bulb that made everything look small and true. I remember the dresses we'd wear for videos, the camera's click, the directions shouted from a hallway. I learned to behave for the lens. That performance was a training in silence. When the ring was slipped on my finger, it was framed as a mark of being chosen. I was told stories that made me important, and that importance became a chain. Adults around me treated me like I belonged to them in a way that blurred care and control. There were ceremonies and dance sessions filmed in basements. If a child resisted, correction came. Righteous voices invoking scripture turned into beatings or removals. I watched other children get spanked for ruining a tape. I felt shame for things I didn't fully understand. The message was clear. Obedience kept you safe. Questions made you dangerous. That ring followed me for years, literally and in memory. It fit my little finger long after the joke had stopped being funny. It sat in drawers. It turned up in boxes when we moved countries. It would sometimes jingle when my hands moved in the dark, a tiny echo of the day my agency began to be taken. My mother, Sarah Kelly, loved me with the only language she knew. She was a person trapped inside a system as much as a participant in it.
There were times I believed she was protecting me. There were times she handed me over because the orders came from above, and she was exhausted, indoctrinated, or coerced. The nuance matters. It's easy to paint a portrait of betrayal or of villainy. Real life rarely fits neat categories. She was both my mother and a woman navigating pressure from leaders who made themselves the interpreter of God's will. That pressure rippled through families the way a tide pulls at the sand. You can't always tell which pieces were swept away by force and which sank under their own weight. Adults like Uncle Jerry, Jeremy Spencer, and Auntie Julie, Dora, were surrogate parents for many of us. They took turns with guardianship, sometimes loving, sometimes strict, always under the umbrella of the group's rules. Children were passed, relocated, shipped from one country to another. We left the Philippines, spent seasons in Japan and Brazil, and were later moved to Mexico City. The world for us was a series of households, each one a chapter in a larger story written by others. We were global, yes, but also contained. The world outside seemed like another language we didn't understand. The grooming system worked in quiet ways and in loud ones. It normalized adult behaviors through repetition. It told us that certain boundaries were spiritual truth. It infantilized us while forcing us into roles that demanded premature responsibility. It used images, photographs, and publications to freeze us into a narrative, picture-perfect children praising the leader, smiling for the camera, obedient and holy. Those images were propaganda, but more than that, they became our identities. We began to see ourselves through how we were photographed. I learned survival skills that were practical and tiny. Cut my hair short so I wouldn't be pretty enough to draw attention. Volunteer for kitchen duty because food distribution had a system, and being behind a pot kept my hands busy and my face unseen. Learn to move silently in the night so that if a door opened, the worst would pass me by. Lying became something of a reflex, white lies to avoid notice, bigger lies to hide pain. I was a master at small evasions before I was old enough to vote. We had a hierarchy even among children. Some were labeled special by leadership. That label was both a shield and a target. It meant more visibility, more praise, more writing about you, but also more vulnerability to the leader's interest. Puberty and the body's changes were interpreted through a lens that sexualized the spiritual. I was told that being chosen had sacred meaning. The sacred meanings were often used as justifications for things that were not sacred at all. The basement videos were an instrument of control. They freezed us into roles, made our vulnerabilities a public spectacle, and then used those images to discipline us. If the tape didn't go the way it was supposed to, someone would get punished.
I remember once being slapped because I ruined a take. The sound of hand on skin in that dim room echoed like a verdict. Yet even inside that environment, small rebellions took shape. A discarded magazine, a letter slipped under a door, a peer who cleared their throat and said, "I don't want to do this anymore." These were seeds. Ricky and my older sister were among those who left earlier. Their departures were rumors at first. Then they were real letters that arrived like contraband, with inked words that spoke of grocery stores and bank accounts and the taste of ice cream. Those letters changed the room they came into. They introduced the possibility that life could exist outside the script we'd been given. Letters carry oxygen. Once the words arrived, I could breathe differently. The idea that a bus could take you from Mexico City to Houston seemed at once absurd and necessary. We had been moved so many times that the idea of getting on a vehicle and not being assigned a new guardian felt almost revolutionary. Leaving was not a movie scene. There was no dramatic rescue. There was planning that felt like smuggling. There were moments of terror, of bargaining with myself, of imagining being dragged back. There were practical things to figure out: passports, cash, who would take you somewhere safe at the other end. I learned the math of escape like you learn the multiplication table, precise, repeated until it becomes muscle memory. I counted the cost in bus tickets rather than in guilt. The bus ride from Mexico City to Houston is a hinge in my mind. I don't romanticize it. It was cold, it was crowded, and it was loud. It was also, for the first time, a deliberate movement toward a life that I had chosen for myself. I arrived in Houston with little more than a backpack and a set of new rules to learn: how to make a phone call without someone else listening, how to sleep without being startled awake by someone entering the room, how to say no and mean it. My early days in the United States were small victories that felt enormous. My first night, I had ice cream. It sounds almost ridiculous to list such a commonplace pleasure, but eating ice cream as the person who had been told what to eat and when felt like a reclamation. I saw my first movie in a theater with no one filming us. I understood then, slowly, that leisure was not a privilege reserved for the chosen few, but a human right. There were practical humiliations. I had to learn the most basic adult tasks that others take for granted: opening a bank account, applying for a social security number, learning to read a lease. In a strange, painful way, those processes taught me how to become myself. I remember being terrified of the bank teller's questions. "Do you have ID?" she'd ask, and the little voice in me would scramble. But step by step, I built paperwork. My first job was as a receptionist. The phone became a tool instead of a trap.
I learned to answer to my name without reflexively adding, "Yes, sir." I learned to be accountable to myself. The world pushed back with its own complications. Reintegration is not a clean break. There's grief for what you lost, confusion about what you missed, and sometimes guilt for surviving. I felt shame, like I had to make my past smaller to live forward. That shame was heavy, until I began to understand it as a shadow cast by someone else's power, not my own truth. In therapy, I started to name what happened without using euphemism. Naming was a form of untangling. Education became a way to reclaim voice, literally and metaphorically. I taught myself languages. I learned Portuguese wandering streets in Brazil before I escaped. Later, I picked up Spanish and improved my English. Language gave me options. Saying I in more than one tongue expanded how I could place myself in the world. In time, I would travel to over 40 countries and live in 10. Each passport stamp felt like an exhale. Recovery is not a straight upward line. There were relapses, small flashbacks triggered by a song, a smell, a film clip, a child's laughter that sounded too much like a tape. There are for me practical tools that help steady the ship on those days. The grounding techniques taught in therapy, the community of people who understand the contour of trauma, the rituals that are mine alone. I learned to slow down when my body tightened and to ask for help without feeling like I was asking for permission to exist. Reclaiming my voice took many forms. At first, it was private. I journaled furiously. Pages that began as lists of practical tasks became pages of questions. Who am I without the group's narrative? What do I like? What do I fear? Then I started to speak in small circles, support groups, therapy sessions, people who had been through similar things. Each time I shared, I felt a little more solid. The act of telling is not just about disclosure. It's about rearranging power. When you tell, you are not a passive object in someone else's story. You become a subject in your own. Over time, speaking publicly became part of my healing. I began to write and to give interviews. It felt strange at first to use my voice as testimony, then as warning others about the signs of coercive control, about how rituals and scripture can be twisted into chains. There's a responsibility that comes with that voice. I never wanted to become an instrument of hate. I wanted to hold complexity, accountability for abusers, empathy for coerced family members, and shelter for survivors. Part of reclaiming voice was reclaiming joy. My life did not become a litany of pain. I cultivated pockets of pleasure that were mine by right. A quiet morning with coffee, a crowded market with foreign languages rubbing shoulders, the loud laughter of friends who had nothing to prove.
I built a career that valued my clear thought and capacity for care. Receptionist evolved into roles with more responsibility, and each job taught me how to negotiate, how to set boundaries, how to ask for fair pay. Earning a living under my own terms was another way of speaking. There are practical lessons that helped me navigate life outside the group. Financial literacy was a big one. Opening a bank account, building credit, understanding taxes. I learned how to drive. I learned what a lease looked like. These might sound mundane, but when your childhood taught you that adults always made decisions for you, learning to sign a contract on your own felt revolutionary. I also learned to hold contradictions without collapsing under them. I could love my mother while grieving choices she made under pressure. I could acknowledge the spiritual longing that had been exploited while rebuilding my own sense of faith on different terms. I could mourn the friends and family who remained in the movement while also refusing to be guilted back into silence. These are complicated spaces. Healing does not mean erasing the past. It means making room for a richer present. One morning, I realized I was speaking without rehearsing the words in my head first. I was telling a story at a gathering, and I noticed my hands moving as I talked, my voice rising and falling with conviction instead of fear. That was a turning point. The voice had been practicing in small ways: a phone call, a story to a friend, an essay sent to a small magazine. The moment it showed itself in public wasn't theatrical. It was simply me continuing to live, and my voice following me like a loyal animal. Part of that reclamation came from choosing how I wanted to be seen. I decided I wouldn't let the group's publications be the last word on my life. Those Life with Grandpa pages had frozen my childhood into somebody else's interpretation. I began to write to unfreeze those images, to add footnotes of context, to tell the parts that weren't glamorous, to show the messiness of being human. Writing taught me grammar for my emotions. It gave me sentence structure for a story that had been told in single flatline snapshots. I also learned the power of community. There are organizations and networks of survivors who do not perform your pain, but hold it. I found people who had similar origins and different outcomes. We shared resources, like couch space for someone newly arrived, or a number for a sympathetic immigration lawyer, or the name of a therapist who really understood cult trauma. Those pragmatic acts of solidarity were lifelines. They taught me that reclaiming voice is not only an individual achievement, it's communal. Travel broadened my perspective and let me reframe the narrative of my life.
Walking unfamiliar streets, seeing how people live in different economies and climates,
Learning that human dignity is expressed in countless small ways, these experiences gave me new metaphors to talk about freedom. I could say, for example, that freedom feels like being allowed to buy a loaf of bread you didn't have to earn permission to eat. It sounds silly as a metaphor, but it's a concrete image that unlocked something in me. I want to be clear. Survival is not the same as flourishing. There are still days that feel heavy. There are anniversaries that catch me off guard. My body remembers when my mind doesn't. Grief sneaks in. And yet the balance of my life has shifted toward possibility. I can plan, I can hope, I can set boundaries and have them respected. I can mentor someone younger who used to think silence was safety. That alone is an enormous exchange. Silence traded for speech. There are practical tools I use when triggers come. Grounding exercises, breathing techniques, a small checklist I carry on my phone for bad days. Call a friend, hydrate, step outside for 5 minutes, text a support line. I learned to prepare my body for vulnerability so the mind wouldn't have to hold all of it alone. And I learned to forgive myself for the parts that survival required. The lies told to protect, the alliances formed because there was no other shelter. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing abuse. It was about removing extra shame that made healing heavier. Telling my story is also a moral act. It is a warning to those who might be coaxed into similar systems, and an olive branch to those who remain inside, who might be doubting or fearful. My hope is not to paint everyone in the movement as simply evil, but to expose the mechanisms of control so other people can recognize them. That means describing the everyday, the ritualized punishments, the documented photographs, the ways scripture got twisted into a tool for obedience, without turning survivors into spectacle. As I worked on reclaiming my voice, I found new vocations. I became involved in advocacy work that highlights how religious rhetoric can be manipulated. I spoke at conferences and sat with policy groups. My experience gave me a vantage point not just for telling a story, but for helping others tell theirs to institutions that could act: police, social services, therapists trained in cult dynamics. That was another layer of being heard, having systems recognize the patterns that had been invisible to me as a child. I also invested in small acts of normal life that felt radical: hosting dinner, learning to garden, developing friendships where reciprocity was expected and practiced. Those rituals built trust. They replaced the transactional relationships I had early on with ones where affection didn't have to be earned through spiritual displays. There were moments that still make my throat tight, the sight of a ring, a certain hymn, but my response is different now.
I can name the sensation and sit with it. I can speak aloud to a therapist about the sound that makes me flinch and then decide what to do next. That temporary contraction is no longer a sentence, it is a data point. If you are listening and some part of this resonates, that ring, that feeling of being watched, that quiet fear, know this: you are not meant to carry it alone. There are people and organizations whose work is to support survivors of coercive control and abuse. Below, in the description, I've recommended some resources: hotlines, survivor support groups, and counseling networks. I didn't invent those paths. I followed them. They helped me find housing, legal aid, and therapists who actually understood cult trauma. When I think about the phrase "recover my voice," I mean more than simply being able to speak. Recovering my voice meant learning that my words had weight. It meant trusting that my testimony could matter, not because it was spectacular, but because it was true. It meant stepping into conversations about policy and care, telling a social worker what the pattern of control looked like, or reading my own essay aloud at a small reading and hearing a room receive it. There's a practical side to this: connecting with others who lived similar experiences, finding professionals who understand coercive control, and learning to navigate systems like banks, work, and housing. But there's also a spiritual and emotional side: reshaping how you think about worth, trusting yourself to make decisions, reclaiming the narrative that was once written for you. Both sides are work, and both are valid. I want to tell you about one small scene that still makes me smile. Years after I left, I sat in a cafe with a friend I had made in the city. There was sunlight on the table. I ordered something I had never tasted as a child and could not have been taught to order.
I spoke freely about my plans for a trip to a country I'd only read about in a pamphlet years earlier. My friend listened, laughed, asked questions, and treated me like someone whose life could be ordinary and delicious. That ordinary moment felt like a victory parade.
Sometimes the first step is learning that doubt is allowed. It doesn't make you irreligious or disloyal. It makes you human. I am not here to tell you recovery is immediate or easy. It is not. It is a series of small recoveries. Some days you will move forward, some days you will step back. That is part of the process. But each small act, refusing a harmful instruction, applying for a job, writing a paragraph about yourself, adds up. Before I close, I want to share concrete resources that helped me or that are commonly recommended for people leaving coercive religious movements and for survivors of childhood abuse. Please look for these links in the description if you need them. National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, U.S. 988, Immediate Support for Crisis Situations. RAIN, Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, 800-656-4673, or online chat at rain.org. Confidential support and resources. International Cultic Studies Association, ICSA, culteducation.org. Resources on identifying coercive control and support networks. Local survivor support groups and trauma-informed therapists. Search for cult trauma therapy or religious trauma support in your area. National Domestic Violence Hotline, U.S., 1-800-799-7233, or text START to 88788. For safety planning and resources.
If you are outside the U.S., please check your country's emergency numbers and search for local survivor hotlines and organizations that specialize in coercive control and religious trauma. If you reach out, please do so when you feel safe to, and with someone you trust if possible. If this story has reached you, if you recognize a piece of your life in it, or if it simply moved you, please hold that gently. Healing is possible, and it is not chained to a timetable. If you want to hear more survivor stories, if you want to be part of a community that listens and supports, consider subscribing to channels and organizations that elevate survivor voices. Share this story with someone who might need to know they are not alone. I will end where I started, but with a different sentence.
I was married at 3. But I am not defined by that. I am defined by the choices I make now, the work I do to care for myself and others, the people I love, and the voice I have rebuilt. I speak, I travel, I teach, I write, I advocate, I laugh. I name pain when it needs naming, and shelter people when they need a hand. That is how I recovered my voice. If you or someone you know needs help, check the links in the description for hotlines and resources. If this story helped you, please share it. Let more survivors know they are not alone.